my talk tonight is human beings created in and for relationship. And I want to talk about what this means for our understanding of human flourishing and what it means for our responsibility to respond to relational needs in three specific contexts, which I'll mention shortly. Human beings are relational because God is relational. That's where this conversation has to begin. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit have their being in perfect self-giving and receiving. The three persons of the Trinity share completely and eternally in the same being, knowledge, and activity. And creation is the self-communication of this triune relational God. In creation, God forms and then he fills the spheres of the cosmos, the heavens, the seas, the dry land. And then God makes human beings in his image to cultivate his creation. God commissions humanity to follow the pattern he had set in creation, forming and filling. And that task could only be pursued in community, beginning with the relationship of male and female, but extending to the whole of the family of humanity. God created human beings, male and female, in his image, both individually and in mutual relationship, says the Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck, who was writing a little over a century ago. And he described it this way: God made two out of one so that he could then make the two into one. The two-in-oneness of husband and wife expands with a child into three-in-oneness, expanding and unfolding the one image of God. He goes on to say, from conception onward, a human being is a product of fellowship. Every person is born from and in fellowship. Persons are cared for and nurtured in the context of fellowship and continue in some kind of fellowship throughout life, all the way to one's final breath. Well, God's design for human flourishing is structured around the fellowship of four essential relationships. And the first of those is communion with God. Second is with ourselves, peace within ourselves. The third is harmony with others. And the fourth is nurture towards the created world. True human flourishing is wholeness and harmony in these four relationships. And of course, sin distorts each of them. It produces alienation from God and self and others and the world around us. And it sets up a rival vision of flourishing. In this vision, the path to fulfillment is paved with autonomy and control. We've already mentioned these words today. It resists the givenness and limits of the human condition and our dependence on one another. Expressive individualism is the name that several authors have given to this vision of flourishing. It's a path where each person is on a quest to discover reality for himself, from within himself, and in order to project his self-understanding outside himself to the world. Carter Snead is a bioethics and law professor at Notre Dame, and he's written a very important book called What It Means to Be Human: The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. And he argues that expressive individualism is characteristic of our law and our culture today. The problem is, because this outlook puts such a priority on autonomy and control, it neglects entire dimensions of our human existence. And here's the irony. Expressive individualism disregards the very things that produce the capacity to exercise self-control and autonomy. After all, none of us was born with the capability of being autonomous. Every human child enters the world highly dependent on others, especially a mother, for quite some time. For the better part of 2 decades, a child needs extensive care to survive and to become capable of exercising even a modicum of self-control and independence. And what produces these characteristics in young people? Well, most of you know from very firsthand experience, it takes countless hours of investment over years to nurture a child's ability to make his own way in the world. It requires constant care for the child in his whole person, for his physical and intellectual and relational and psychological development. And I'm emphasizing here the words constant and continual and countless hours because parenting doesn't come with a time card. This is a 24/7 job, multi-decade in its investment of giving. For the child's part, the degree to which a child is able to fully benefit from all this parental giving depends on the gradual emergence of a child's gratitude for what they have received. Ungrateful teenagers are not maximizing what they can gain from their parents. Gratitude is directly related to a child's ability to gain from their parents' giving and investment. Well, the way our law views what it means to be human overlooks all this giving and receiving that I've just described. And why is that? Well, Carter Snead says it's forgotten, our law has forgotten the importance of the body in human flourishing. And it's instead prioritized the self-directed will. It's made of people the image of that thinking thing that Dr. Mitchell talked about in our last session. As a result, since it's forgotten the body, it has also forgotten the relationships that are essential to our existence and flourishing as embodied beings. In other words, human embodiment is not merely a biological reality. It is a relational reality. Because we are embodied, human life goes through seasons of vulnerability, weakness, sickness, and incapacitation. This is always true at the beginning of life. It's often true at the end of life. It's occasionally true through the sequence of life. And in some cases of great disability or severe illness, it's true through the whole of life. Because we are embodied, we need relationships that are characterized by what Carter Snead calls uncalculated giving and graceful receiving in order to make our way through life. The first step towards those kinds of relationships is to recognize the limits and the vulnerabilities we all face as human beings. Accepting the givenness of our embodied existence prepares us to pursue the relationships that are marked by grace in giving and gratitude in receiving. To be equipped for that kind of relationship, we need both active and passive virtues. And here I want to acknowledge Autumn Reidenauer, who's helped me think about these categories of virtues, and we're going to hear from her tomorrow, and hope she'll be able to expand on them quite a bit. Her work is really wonderful, especially on aging, which I'll mention a bit later as well. We need to pursue the active virtues of solidarity and hospitality that make us approach others with care and compassion, generosity and self-sacrifice. And we also need passive virtues of humility and patience and wisdom that reconcile us to our limitations and make us ready to receive others' giving in our own seasons of need. Too often, responses to human need overlook the relational aspects of human flourishing. In order to be effective, compassion must work to restore relationships along those central axes: relationship with God, self, others, and the created world. Tonight I'm going to look at relational responses to human need in three contexts. And the first is pertaining to active virtues: solidarity, hospitality, and the beginning of life. Second is true human flourishing in the context of effective compassion by restoring relationships. And the third is passive virtues in the context of the grace of receiving at the end of life. Now, most of us here are engaged in Christian education in one form or another, and particularly Christian higher education. So throughout this talk, I also want to raise questions that I'm just going to leave lingering that may be productive for thinking about these issues as you go back to campus and are thinking about curriculum and formation issues on these topics. So I'm just laying the top, these are just appetizers to conversations that could be classes, could be conversations, could be colloquia, and would be very, I think, illuminating to us as we struggle with theological anthropology in so many issues of our culture today. So for instance, the questions that I think should be on our mind as we consider guiding students in these topics would be things like, how can we cultivate these active and passive virtues in students? How can we build an understanding of the relational dimensions of true human flourishing across all the disciplines and throughout the curriculum? How do we avoid the specialization within subject matter that loses sight of the holistic nature of human flourishing? So first topic, active virtues of solidarity and hospitality in the context of the beginning of life. Some of you may have engaged the topic of the history of the concept of the person. You've done some reading or even taught on that. And it's a very complex emergence of the concept, even though the concept itself, from a Christian viewpoint, is very straightforward. A person is a human being. All human beings are persons, contrary to what Peter Singer and some others would say. And so the concept is straightforward. The history has been complex. What does the concept of person add to our understanding beyond the idea of human being? What does person add to our understanding of human being? Well, a German Catholic philosopher named Robert Spemann summed it up very simply 25 years ago. Person is a family name, said Spemann. It's the name we give to all the individuals who make up the whole of humanity. It tells us that each member of the human family bears the name person. Now, in a family, multiple people bear the same last name. That doesn't mean, though, that the members of that family are interchangeable parts. To the contrary, each person in the family fills a very specific position within it: mother, father, first son, second son, youngest daughter. You can see this visually in the form of a family tree, and sometimes it's a literal picture of a tree that represents the different lines and layers of the relationships that exist within a family. Each member occupies a specific place on that tree, and they are not interchangeable. If you were going to describe where one person was located on that tree, you would describe it differently than the position and the place that another member of that family occupies in that tree. Well, this uniqueness, utter uniqueness of each individual is why it is so tragic for any family to lose a child, and why even if they welcome a new child into the family and have the joy of that new member, it is not the same as replacing the child that they lost. It is a new member of the family with new relationships and a new family form. In the same way, you can't simply erase the loss of a parent. I married a widower 3 years ago. I'm a widower with 2 teen children, and that brought a certain wholeness to the family, but it is not the same wholeness that the 3 of them once knew. We are not interchangeable parts in our family or in the human family. Here's what Spemann writes: the family name assigns a particular place in the family structure to each one who bears it. In the community of persons, similarly, each person has a place forever uniquely defined as his or hers. Persons form a system of relations in which each is uniquely situated in relation to every other. To be a person is to have a place reserved in the great procession of humanity that extends through all time. It's a distinct location within the human race that cannot be replaced or repeated or erased. Sometimes we hear appeals to respect others because we're all the same. And that's true, so long as we don't understand that to be saying that we are interchangeable. To say that we're all the same or someone is just like me isn't a comment on the similarity of our features. What it's pointing out is that we share utter uniqueness. What each of us has in common is a dignity that cannot be exchanged or replaced. Herman Bavinck wrote beautifully about the image of God, and he taught that God had designed the whole person to image him, that he had made male and female individually and together to extend the image of God in the world. And more than that, he wrote this: the image of God is much too rich for it to be fully realized in a single human being. It can only be somewhat unfolded in its depths and riches in a humanity counting billions of members. Only humanity in its entirety is the fully finished image, the most telling and striking image and likeness of God. What a wonderful picture. And with that picture of the whole of humanity throughout all time in mind, what a staggering fact it is that 60 million unborn children have had their lives snuffed out by abortion since the time that Roe v. Wade was decided. These are lives that took their place in humanity for a moment, but never had the opportunity to unfurl in that great banner that proceeds through time. And that's because they were outside the circle of the protection of personhood. To recognize personhood implies moral responsibility, and that the law did not extend that protection and did not exercise that moral responsibility towards these unborn children. Person is not a descriptive term, says Spemann, it's normative. And he explains that to call someone a person doesn't just make a declaration, it makes a demand. And what it demands of us is to show solidarity in recognizing others as persons and to extend hospitality in welcoming them. It compels us to exercise the duties of care and compassion towards one another, to seek the flourishing of others. But in the case of the unborn child, rather than treating her as a person toward whom we have responsibility, abortion law has taken a much different view. And here Carter Snead points out that the anthropology that Roe v. Wade left us treats the unplanned pregnancy as a conflict between two atomized strangers who are isolated in their vulnerability. Well, there are indeed two vulnerable persons in the midst of an unplanned pregnancy, but they are not strangers, says Professor Snead. Their embodiment situates them in a relation of mother and child, and the flourishing of the child depends entirely on the mother. For her part, the mother's carrying her unborn child is already the beginning of a relationship of incalculable giving. There are two vulnerable persons in an unplanned pregnancy, but they are not strangers, and they should not be isolated. Their vulnerability calls for the compassionate care of the community, and that's particularly true as we approach the mother. She needs a community of care for her holistic needs, especially relationally. Well, what might this mean for our responsibility and opportunity in Christian education? One thing to consider is how we can work to restore relationships so that mothers who find themselves in these situations of unplanned pregnancy are not isolated and do not have an overwhelming sense of vulnerability, especially as the terrain may be changing with respect to abortion law nationally. This is an opportunity for campuses to think about how we could serve our communities in this regard, so that mothers do not experience isolation and vulnerability. Well, moving to the second topic, true human flourishing, effective compassion through restoring relationships. I've already mentioned Herman Bavinck, and one of the central ideas in his work is the idea that grace restores nature. In other words, God's grace restrains and overcomes the effects of sin to restore creation towards what it was intended to be. Bavinck uses the biblical metaphor of leaven to explain how the Christian faith works into all aspects of life. A Christian worldview serves as a leaven, an activating agent that enables everything to expand toward the fullness of its created potential. Bavinck applies the idea of grace-restoring nature to these four essential relationships that I've been mentioning. God designed us for a right relationship with Him, with ourselves, with others, and with the world around us. Sin fractured each of those relationships, and God's grace operates to restore them. In our context today, the challenges that individuals and communities face, from homelessness to opioid addiction to suicide, have to do with brokenness in one or more of these relationships. Child poverty, for example, is highly correlated with the absence of a father. Most long-term poverty occurs in homes where there's only one parent, and it's usually a single mom. Christian responses to these social challenges need to consider how to restore relationships. Flourishing is about more than material need. Flourishing is about more than self-determination. Our concern in serving others must be for the whole person in each of these relationships. And the framework of relating these four essential relationships of God, self, others, and the created world helps us to stay focused on true human flourishing as we approach issues of social challenge. My friend Bob Woodson just retired from 4 decades of work with neighborhood leaders in combating drug addiction, gang violence, prisoner recidivism, homelessness, violence. And last year he wrote a book about what he's learned over these years, and it's called Lessons from the Least of These. And in that book, Bob shares observations and about what he has seen change lives and communities. One of the primary lessons that he shares is that trust that transforms comes through personal presence. He says this: relationships are the necessary condition for transforming others, and trust is the common currency. Relationships of trust can only be built by being available to those in need, even to the point of inconvenience. One of the projects that Bob had helped to organize over the years was a program that sought to combat violence in communities by changing the culture of the community, specifically through working to transform the character of leaders, youth leaders in that community who were involved in gang violence, but little by little, by the change of their character, directed their leadership in a different trajectory. Like Bob said, that requires presence and relationships and trust. And people like Victor and Don Barnett, who run a community organization called Running Rebels in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for them it means giving their cell phone numbers to teens who may call them any time of day or night when trouble comes, who don't have parents to call, and who treat Victor like a father figure and reach out to Dawn like a mentor and a mother. In an interview last year, Don Barnett said this: "We pour into young people. We plant seeds in hopes that they will come back around to help the next generation." Well, this is effective compassion. Effective compassion is relational, and that requires time. Effective compassion is committed to face-to-face, trust-building, long-term relational work with those in need. Now, the local church in particular ought to have this approach to its mercy ministries. After all, the church is founded on a restored relationship. Christians of all people should know what transformed relationships look like, and we should know that when we are seeking to overcome challenge, it is going to require relational ministry. But because material need is so obvious and urgent at times, churches can fall into the trap of focusing narrowly on physical resources to the neglect of caring for the whole person, especially by rebuilding relationships. Years ago, leaders in Leesburg, Florida, the First Baptist Church of Leesburg, Florida, realized that their efforts to run a soup kitchen and a shelter had fallen into this mistake. Each day, the same men would show up, and the church realized that they needed more help than a roof over their heads and a hot meal. They needed to tackle deeper issues, particularly drug addiction, substance abuse. So the church started a residential rehabilitation center for men that could provide that holistic help. And as a residential center, it was able to build relationships with these men, to give them the relational support that they needed. It gave them the opportunity to find freedom in Christ, to overcome addiction, to gain skills like literacy in finances and job training. Well, this model is not one, not every church is able to or called to start a residential center of this sort. But every church can evaluate its mercy ministries to see if it is bringing the full resources of the relational capital of the Church of Jesus Christ to bear on the social challenges and the relational challenges around them. The Chalmers Center at Covenant College, led by Brian Fickert, has resources that can help deacons and other mercy ministry leaders evaluate this and think more constructively about how to engage community assistance in this way. Brian Fickert has written a book called Helping Without Hurting. His co-author is Steve Corbett, and it's a guide for individuals and churches to consider how we serve others and whether we are doing that in a way that helps rather than hurts. Material and relational needs shouldn't be pitted against each other as though we have to choose to address one or the other. Meeting material needs is actually a part of building relationship. And that's a point that Pastor Chris Six makes in his book, Tangible. He says, our mercy ministries ought to demonstrate and declare God's compassion for bodies and souls. Well, we are designed to grow in the interdependence of family, to weave lives of mutual support with our neighbors. We're created to connect with others as we work to provide for our households and to solve social challenges together. Thick networks of relationships are the best kind of social insurance for the unexpected developments of life in a family or in a community. What might this mean for our responsibility and opportunity on Christian education campuses? A few things to consider. First, what would it look like for each academic discipline to contribute to cultivating those thick networks that provide social support? How could each discipline help to grow and prosper thick networks of relationship? How could church congregations and Christian colleges serve Christ's work of restoring relationships in our communities, especially by rebuilding marriage and family, which are so key to lifelong thriving for all members of the family? Third, and finally, our passive virtues, the grace of receiving at the end of life. In an age that defines flourishing as autonomy and control, end of life and the declining capacities that are typically associated with it are an ominous cloud on the horizon. The prospect of incapacitating illness, debilitation, and death are anathema from this worldview. And because of that, sadly, physician-assisted suicide has emerged, ostensibly as a way to maintain autonomy and control in our last days in the face of terminal illness. It appeals to the fear of losing independence and becoming a burden on loved ones. You remember the name of Brittany Maynard. She became the face and the well-known advocate of physician-assisted suicide when she was diagnosed in 2014 with a rare form of brain cancer and was given 6 months to live. She moved to Oregon so that she could end her life with doctor-prescribed drugs, as she said, when the time seemed right. Well, across the country in Connecticut, a woman named Maggie Carner was diagnosed about the same time with the same form of brain cancer. And Maggie was an advocate for life and health policy for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. I had the privilege of meeting her several years earlier when her work in that capacity brought her to Washington, D.C. And she was a force for life. She was a force for good, Maggie. Brittany and Maggie shared the same terminal diagnosis. Maggie wrote an open letter to Brittany Maynard in October 2014, days before Brittany had announced that she would take her own life. And in that letter, Maggie appealed to Brittany to remember the unique presence and beauty that her life gave to the world. Maggie asked her to consider the gift she could give her family by remaining to squeeze out every drop of life during the unknown number of days that remained. Maggie's letter told about her own family's experience decades earlier when Maggie's father was paralyzed from the neck down, and he couldn't do anything for himself. He had to have hospice care for his remaining 5 months on this earth. But he was able to talk, and that's what he and his children did. Maggie wrote to Brittany, "I never had that kind of candor and intimacy with my dad before those days. My brothers and sisters and I, we learned more about ourselves and each other than we ever could have in any other way. We grew as a family, and we learned about sacrifice and love. Each of us became wiser and better people through that whole experience." Maggie looked back on those days as a gift, and she encouraged Brittany to let her family give to her through all her remaining days. Well, Brittany chose to end her own life on November 1st, 2014. She was 29. For her part, Maggie accepted to walk the full path of suffering. Her remaining days were filled with giving and receiving in the company of her family. She died September 25th, 2015. She was 52. Many centuries ago, Augustine observed that growing old and nearing death point us to an eternal Sabbath rest that we hear about in the book of Hebrews. That future rest is the ultimate calling of those in Christ, and aging is preparation for it. This is Autumn Ridenauer writing in Sabbath Rest as Vocation, Aging Towards Death. And it's a wonderful book that gives us a much different outlook than the prevailing perspective on aging today. The limits of aging and death teach us to depend on God. They make us recognize the reality of our contingency, of our finite existence in relation to our infinite God. And recognizing those limits makes us put a high premium on our days. It makes us prioritize. It helps us to make commitments to people and projects in light of that eternal perspective. We are to accompany one another in times of need and vulnerability, and especially in this passage through old age. As Autumn writes, aging teaches us that we are time-bound creatures made for transcendence. This transforms the experience of aging and death as one of interdependence, giving, receiving, and vocation before God and one another. Augustine reminded us in his great work, The City of God, that rightly ordered love pursues the right objects of love, and it seeks them with the right terminus in mind. The full human flourishing that we all long for will not be reached in this life. The city of man has always set its sights too low. Its horizon is too short for its aspirations. Its vision only reaches as far as the temporal, but its longings reach for more. And if we are united with Christ, we can accept limits in this temporal life because we know that we will one day transcend them through communion with our Creator and our Redeemer. Accepting the givenness of our human embodied existence allows us to keep our sights set on transcendence. As we make our way towards that horizon, relationships characterized by grace in giving and gratitude in receiving carry us through this veil of tears. The fluctuation of our interdependence on those relationships makes us lean alternately on the active virtues of compassion and care, and then on the passive virtues of humility and patience and wisdom. And so we move from strength to strength until we appear before God and reach our sweet Sabbath rest. Thank you.